Ecclesiastes chapter 1, the Koheleth, or the preacher of the Old Testament, makes a very interesting statement there as he begins the thesis of his book. And so we're going to read that as we consider this idea of the challenge of pleasure. There in verses 1 to 4, and then I'll jump to verses 8 and 11. The word of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What profit is a man from his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, "See, this is new"? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of the former things, nor will there be any remembrance of the things that are to come by those who will come after. The irony of these weighted words is that they were uttered by one sitting on a throne, one possessing absolute power, riches, and pleasure at his disposal. King Solomon was the paragon of success. He had everything. But it's ironic that it is he who complains about the monotony of life. And so as we read this, we see that it is intriguing to consider that it is Solomon who in all his pomp and glory is exhausted by life, and not Job. Most humans are challenged by the idea of pain, not pleasure. There are endless books written about pain, but particularly almost none about pleasure. C.S. Lewis wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasure, and he shouts to us in our pain." So most people complain about suffering and pain in the world, but almost no one complains about a very common malady in the world called pleasure. I believe the only book I've written on pleasure was written in the 60s called The Culture of Narcissism. And that writer takes it particularly from a psychological perspective and presents psychological theories as to what this culture has become in its leisure and its prosperity, a culture of narcissism. But we live, as did most past civilizations that internally declined and collapsed, in a pleasure-driven culture. We are in an age where the church itself is engulfed in the same miseries of the pleasure-driven culture. Who would have thought we would have seen an age where a large percentage of Christians have to go on a weekly visit to a psychiatrist or a marriage counselor? And it's interesting that the sociological era of psychiatry is the same sociological era of a pleasure-driven culture. It's interesting that the church suffers from the very same woes. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:1, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men," and you might add in parentheses, "men in the church will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And from such people, turn away. You see, these types of mentalities are contagious. So it is this pleasure syndrome that has brought us to the present cultural condition. So let's consider the challenge of pleasure. First, let's look at pleasure's journey. Let's read there in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 1 and on. This is the assessment of Solomon. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. I said of laughter, madness. And of myrrh, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had great possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, the musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. All my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward with all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and all the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Solomon's assessment of pleasure is an indictment on the abuse of leisure. His declaration is that pleasure as life's singular drive leads to the anxiety of meaninglessness. There's an old English writer named F.W. Borum. He wrote these words: laughter, merriment, and fun were quite evidently intended to occupy a large place in this world, yet in no subject under the sun has the church displayed more embarrassment and confusion. One Christian follows a round of gaiety with the modesty of merriment. Another wears a hair shirt and starves himself into a skeleton. One treats life as all a frolic, another as a funeral. We swing like a pendulum from the indulgence of an Epicurean to the severities of a Stoic, failing to recognize with the author of Ecce Homo that it is in Christianity, while rejecting the absurdities of each, it combines cardinal excellence to both. We allow without knowing why we allow. We ban without knowing why we prohibit. We confound for sins we are inclined to by damning those we have no mind to. Our theories about pleasure are a hopeless confusion. Is there no definite doctrine of amusement? Is there no philosophy of fun? There must be. Thank God there is. These are very incisive words of Mr. Borum. And that statement where he says we confound for sins we are inclined to by damning those we have no mind to. And so he's making the statement that we really don't take the time to think things through, especially the idea of pleasure. So as we think about this, we first of all recognize that humans possess an insatiable appetite for distraction. So that means that amusement must be timely and measured. All pleasures require discretion in its selection and wisdom in its management. Undefined and unrestrained pleasure inevitably lead to results in personal and cultural life, and many times that ends in misery. Nothing renders a culture more trivial and obnoxious more effectively than unbridled leisure and pleasure. Pleasure no longer brings refreshment and amusement. Instead, it brings self-inflicted affliction. Let's look at pleasure's principles. How can we have pleasure and yet keep it within a boundary of legitimacy and joy, and to enjoy it adequately and properly? Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1 says, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven." So pleasure must have boundaries in order to remain healthy and enjoyable. Boundary markers are designed to protect and to set guidelines. The secret of a balanced life is possessing the wisdom to adequately measure our convictions, our commitments, our work, and our leisure. This is the first principle. Anything that refreshes us without diminishing or distracting us from our ultimate purpose is a legitimate pleasure. Let me repeat that. Anything that refreshes without diminishing or distracting us from our ultimate purpose is a legitimate pleasure. Many brilliant minds and lives of promising individuals have been squandered on the path of unbridled pleasure. How many of us can think of such individuals in our experiences? Young people must set clearly defined goals for life. We must all form a vision and define our purpose in life. Consistency requires intentional focus. We must arrange everything we do according to our ultimate purpose. Susanna Wesley defines sin to her children like this: whatever weakens your reasoning, impair the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, or takes away your relish for spiritual things, if anything increases the power and authority of the flesh over the spirit, that becomes sin to you, regardless of how good it is in itself. That definition includes distorted religious thinking. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 16. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Verse 20. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Distorted thinking can destroy even a religious individual. So spiritual survival requires a well-developed sense of responsibility. That involves the power of self-discipline That is, self-discipline must be cultivated. It also involves understanding that injurious and weakening habits must be eradicated. We are creatures of habit. And many of our habits can become bad habits. So we must eradicate those. And next, habits that empower our capacity to live consistent to our purpose must be deliberately developed. We must choose our relationships wisely. Relationships can either reinforce or ruin our spirituality. That is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil company corrupts good habits. So any pleasure that we consider must be consistent with these elements. That brings us to principle number 2. Any pleasure that jeopardizes or devalues the sacred worth of others is an illicit pleasure. Any pleasure that jeopardizes or devalues the sacred worth of others is an illicit pleasure. Let me give you an example in the Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 23. In the life of David, he's in the Adullam, and he desires water from the well of Bethlehem, his hometown. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. And David said with longing, oh, that someone would give me a drink of the water from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate. So the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink, but poured it out to the Lord and said, far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is this not the blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives? Therefore he would not drink it. David understood the sacred principle. Any pleasure that jeopardizes or devalues the sacred worth of others is an illicit pleasure. He understood the same principle declared by our Savior Jesus in Matthew 22:37, when he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. To love God, he says, is the foundation to all things. To love others is the imperative that comes from that foundation. So as we consider this, we must realize that our culture is permeated with many contexts in which this principle is constantly violated. It is the greatest of tragedies when a gifted man or woman is conquered by untamed pleasure. Look at David. He was ruined by Bathsheba. From the time that David sinned with Bathsheba, the entire kingdom went spiraling downwards till it completely disappeared. Look at Alexander the Great. All that success and only to be ruined by power, wine, and orgies, and died from a hangover. How many of us have sacrificed our commitments, our relationships, our convictions for a momentary pleasure? All those claims, all those declarations, all those discussions, all that debating goes down the moment we give in to an illicit pleasure, because it shows those convictions have no true root in our character. And we must begin all over again. So whatever or whoever we are, at some point in our journey, our character will be tested. Such is the account of Job. It's our third principle. Any pleasure, however good in itself, if not measured and balanced, will distort reality and destroy appetite. Proverbs 25 and verse 16 says, "Have you found honey? Eat only as much as you need, lest you be filled with it and vomit." You see, all pleasure must be kept in balance. And the balanced life is the most difficult to live. There is a time for everything. We must distinguish and proportionately measure every facet of our lives in ways that move us toward our ultimate purpose in Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul is having this great discussion about idolatry and all these battles that challenge the ancient Christians, he says this to them in verse 31. "Therefore, whether you eat or you drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." What is he saying? Any pleasure, however good in itself, if not measured and balanced, will distort reality and destroy appetite. And such pleasure is not glorifying God. As we consider this, we move to the third consideration, which is pleasure's formula for life. How then are we to see pleasure? How then are we to use pleasure? Well, first of all pleasure must be based on labor. In fact, all pleasure, all legitimate pleasure, must be based on pain. What does that mean? It means this. With legitimate pleasure, the price is paid before it is enjoyed. With illicit pleasure, the price is paid after it is enjoyed. All you need to do is look at your culture around you, and you see that we are plagued with that thing called consequences. You see, with legitimate pleasure, we learn to say no. We learn when to say no. Second, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. It comes from being weary of pleasure. It becomes the nausea of existence. No one is more fed up with life than the one who has exhausted pleasure in his or her life. Some of the loneliest people on earth are those who are given to pleasure, those who live their lives in unrestrained indulgence, and many of them live on the brink of suicide. When we consider playwright Oscar Wilde, who wrote the portrait of Dorian Gray, we find that he exhausted his health with promiscuous living by the age of 46. And on his dying bed, he said, "Bring me a priest. Nothing but Jesus Christ is big enough for my weary heart." This is a man who had lived his life saying, "There is no God. Let us eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow we die. Life is a party." And he destroyed himself in the process. And in the end, he realized nothing but Jesus is big enough for a weary heart. So pleasure must not become the purpose for living. And the closer we move to pure pleasure, the closer we come to God. We come closer to Him. And the closer we move to impure pleasures, the farther we drift from God. When we do the beautiful things of life, it gives God great pleasure. God enjoys us when we do those wonderful things of life. Pure, clean pleasure. So as we conclude, the greatest challenge of pleasure is that it presents the choice of doing things God's way or doing things our way. When we do things our way, it usually ends in disaster or at least disenchantment. When we do things and live life God's way, the novelties of life are boundless, and the delights of healthy pleasures are fulfilling and never damaging. So as we close, we say, God designed life for variety and balanced pleasure to be lived with simplicity and to be enjoyed in the versatility of His blessings and goodness. The human heart longs for an intimacy that touches both body and soul. And God has provided that for us in worship. You see, when we worship and when we're involved with the communion of the Lord's table, we find that worship and communion are the sacred experiences wherein we feel, we touch, and we taste while we focus our hearts on God's nature and love. Because worship is the submission of all our being to God. It is the purifying of our conscience by His holiness, the nourishment of our minds and soul by His truth, the sanctifying of our imagination by His beauty. It is the opening of our hearts to His will and His love, and the surrender of our will to His purposes. All this unified in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. This singular vision directs everything in our lives and equips us to successfully manage the challenges of pleasure. As we close, I ask, how is it with you today? Has pleasure brought some form of tyranny into your life? Do you need someone to rescue you from the grips of a pleasure-ridden life? Only Jesus Christ is big enough for your weary heart. As He says in Matthew 11:28 and 30, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."